Welcome, 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 welcome. Surviving the heat wave, but still making time to come and present the information to you. Part of our continuing series where we interview reporters, writers, activists, columnists, academics, professors, anybody around the world, anyone in America, anyone from the left, anyone from the right, as long as they can provide complete, thoughtful perspectives so that we can provide it directly to you, the public, unedited and unaltered. So you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. With us today, it's our privilege to have Preston John Stovall. He works at the Department of Philosophy and Social Sciences at the University of Hradec, Králové.
Králové. Yeah, that's a tough one.
Say it one more time.
Hradec, Králové.
Hradec, Králové.
Yeah. I'm not even saying it right, so don't feel bad.
Okay, to the people at the university, I tried. I'm not going to try anymore. I don't want to butcher your name, but I did give it a good faith effort. He is teaching there. And where is that university at, Professor?
It's in the Czech Republic. It's east of Prague, about 2 hours by train.
Okay. And that's where he teaches, assistant professor of philosophy and social sciences. He's assistant professor there at the university beginning in 2022. He was also the program manager and instructor for critical thinking about social media, Center for Science, Technology, Ethics, Society at Montana State University in 2021. He was postdoctoral researcher on inferentialism naturalized at the same university. Also postdoctoral researcher in inferentialism and collective intentionality. Intermittent online teaching at La Roque University, Montana State University, Park University, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, beginning spring 2016. Responsible for designing Park University's Fundamentals of Logic course. He's also an education researcher, Studium Consulting, beginning fall 2016, principal organizer for the programs of pre-college philosophy in Pennsylvania, Montana, and the Czech Republic. Also an assistant professor at St. Vincent College and a visiting lecturer at the University of Pittsburgh. 1 second, get the computer to work. Okay, and here's a look at some of the research that he's done. Modeling descriptive and deontic cognition as two models of relation between the mind and world. Practical cognition, motor intentionality, and the idea of the good. Considerations of denotational and connotational meaning. Essence of modality, a proof theoretic and nominalist analyst. Wow, this is new to me. Introduction, themes in the study of human cognition as a social phenomenon, normative attitudes, shared intentionality, discursive cognition, rationality, autonomy, and obedience, syllogistic reasoning as a ground for the content of judgment. The metaphysics of practical rationality, the single-minded animal, shared intentionality, normativity, and the foundations of discursive cognition, and what we ought and shall do, a hyperstate semantics for descriptive, prescriptive, and intentional sentences. We'll leave it there. There are reasons. Okay, here we go. And this is the article that I found him at, Education as a Public Resource for Addressing American Political Polarization. But before we get into that, let's check in and see how well we did. Professor, did I make any mistakes? Is there something that we need to correct?
Nope, that is just fine. There's some stuff there that is difficult to pronounce, not the least of which is the university I'm at, the town that I live in, so don't feel bad about that. And my work is kind of all over the place, so if you approached it from the standpoint of the stuff I'm doing on political polarization, I wouldn't expect you to have much to say about hyperstate semantics, for instance.
Okay, I'm interested because I like learning new things, and there's some terms or words I haven't seen before, which is really hard to do to me, but we got a limited time, so I want to focus on political polarization. Maybe I'll have you back. We can talk about the other stuff.
Happy to do it.
Okay, great. This was the article, Education as a Public Resource for Addressing American Political Polarization. An educated populace is crucial for a well-functioning democracy, and in the U.S., the use of pamphlets, periodicals, opinion pieces, and public letters stretching back to more than before the revolution testifies to the importance that American place on educated public. The interest found kindred expression and a general concern with education in the United States and the colonies, one that many of the founders shared, Benjamin Franklin. Okay, well, what is this article roughly about, and why was it important, and if you could explain, are you from America, or do you just speak really well American?
No. I'm a U.S. citizen, born in the U.S. My father was in the army, so I'm a military brat, and so
Okay.
I had a lot of experience overseas by the time I was in high school, and then I
Okay.
lived in the Czech Republic for 6 years. So I always enjoyed the experience of being an American overseas, and then I'm from Montana, so being able to, all of my grandparents, with the exception of one, were born in Montana. So I'm really rooted in Montana. That was always home for me. That's where I did my undergraduate work. And I feel lucky to be able to have that kind of a background to draw from when, for instance, I'm in Montana now. So I'm back for the summer. And
Oh, okay.
I feel lucky about that because, you know, um, Europeans give Americans a lot of crap for not knowing where Portugal or Belgium is on a map. But my standard response is, yeah, but do you know where Nebraska is? And if you grow up in the US, if you grow up in Montana, the difference between a vacation in New York City or LA or Chicago or Miami is pretty substantial. And so coming from a place like Montana, I feel lucky to have that kind of background to draw from. So.
Okay, so an American who's traveled around, seen the world, spent some time in Europe. I remember being in college, and one of my college roommates was second generation German. And he spoke so fondly of the Czech Republic. And he was German, and he'd been to Germany and Austria. And he goes, the Czech Republic is the place to go. The architecture, the people, the beer.
I think it is wonderful. I really feel lucky to be where I am. The culture is great. It reminds me of Montana in a lot of ways. They have a great relationship to their land. They have more hiking trails per capita than anywhere else in the world. They're very outdoorsy. They have gardens. If they've got green space, they use it to garden. They're very self-sufficient. And I've talked with this about this with my Czech friends. And my sense is that that's largely due to the Soviet influence after the Prague Spring of '68. In the late '60s, that youth ferment hit the Czech people as well, Czechoslovakians, and the Soviets came in and put a kibosh on it. And as a result, the Czechs couldn't travel for 3 decades. So they couldn't, being under the Soviet influence, they didn't have the kind of access to resources that you did, say, in Western Germany. And so as a result, they developed a lot of stuff internal to their own country, and they've maintained that. And I love it. I think it's just a great place. Plus the architecture and the food and the beer.
That's what I'd heard. I had heard about the architecture. I heard, Austria, but I'll check out Czechoslovakia. You want to see some really old, magnificent architecture. But this isn't a travel show. Maybe I'll have you back and we can talk about travel and the other research projects you work on with new terms I've never heard before because I like to learn. But for today, we'll focus on political polarization. As I always like to say, one world-shattering problem at a time, and then we'll move on to the next. What is this article about? It came out in 2020, and what is it saying? And also, if you could speak, as an American with two working eyeballs, not just an academic, what's going on in 2020? Pretend I've been in a cave for the last 7 years. What's going on in America? Why is this an issue? Why is it important? Why did you feel that it was worthwhile of studying? Speak to me like I don't know what's going on, please.
Sure. Okay, fair enough. So I think by 2016, it was pretty clear that there were substantial divisions in the country that reached not only individuals at a ground level, but institutions all the way up to the two primary political parties. The Trump election, the stuff that came out of the WikiLeaks dump about the way things were being handled by the Democratic National Party. The fact that Trump could get the nomination and then win the election, these things were big signifiers for a lot of people. Now, I've been interested in the state of public discourse and conversation among Americans for quite a while. When I was an undergraduate in Montana, I was sort of pushing from the left progressive side, and that was the kind of approach I was taking. By the time I got to graduate school, I was surrounded by people who were already in that view, and then I found myself more and more pushing from the I don't know if you'd say conservative or maybe classical liberal side of things. So sorry.
I'm joking. I've
Oh,
been where you're at before. I've had a
yeah.
lot of liberal friends, and you start going, well, some of the things they said on the right, I'm not joining them, but it's not completely horrible. And it's like, whoa, whose side are you on? I apologize.
Well, so to speak to this essay, then this is exactly the kind of thing that made me want to look into this. So as I finished my undergraduate or my graduate education, and as I was looking at these issues, I was running a discussion group on American identity for 2014 and 2015, and into 2016, and the Heterodox Academy had just been founded. So, do you know what the Heterodox Academy is? I
I
would
have
imagine.
interviewed the guy who ran that,
Okay.
and I've interviewed a few other people who've done the heterodox, anti-heterodox Academy podcast.
The Anti-Heterodox Academy.
I mean, I'm getting it wrong. The podcast associated with that group. I've
I
interviewed the
see.
guy
Gotcha.
that
Gotcha.
started that. He was upset that the podcast got canceled. I even wrote an essay on his behalf to the Heterodox Academy saying you need to get the show back up and running because it's the only group that does it. And I interviewed about 4 or 5 people from that group.
Well, what I admired about what they were doing, it was the attempt to talk across boundaries. I think that's really important. And part of the research that formed the backdrop of this essay was stuff that I'd read about on the Heterodox Academy's blog. This stuff from Sean Stevens in particular was a big influence. And then I was looking at this stuff from the Pew Research Center too. And it struck me that this forms the kind of introduction to the essay. It struck me that you saw from the Pew Research Center this rise of not only unfavorable, but very unfavorable views from each side, left and right, from about 15% for each side, 16 or 17% in the 90s, to just under 50% in 2014, to over 50% in 2016. And at the same time, the number of people from each side overestimates the number of people on the other side that hold the extreme positions. So just those 2 data points give some indication that there are people in the middle who would be more willing to talk to each other if they knew how much they already agreed about, but they're unaware of it because the people on the extremes are the ones doing the talking. And then I think if you just look at the way media institutions developed in the 90s and early 2000s, partly on their own in terms of the way Fox became a kind of firebrand for one side that then pushed organizations like MSNBC and CNN to do the same sort of thing from the other. But then also the influence of new media and the way that kind of financial incentive system influences old media as well. I think you can see that there's something going on there. So this essay was an attempt to try to intervene by pointing out some of these things that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, but that we've got now good data, some of it going back decades, showing that's happened, and then make some suggestions about what the educator could do in terms of trying to ameliorate some of these problems by way of encouraging conversation across boundaries.
So the idea is that political polarization is happening. How can we reduce it in the education setting, and perhaps some tips on how people in the education setting can reduce polarization, specifically within the education setting?
Yeah, so that would be the distal goal. I'm very leery of trying to have even covertly, I mean, certainly covertly, but I'm leery of trying to have political goals as a primary focus of education. I think that's part of the problem, certainly in terms of the way the right in the United States is looking at higher education today. So I wouldn't want to, the way I frame it in the essay is, look, you can't have mutual agreement without mutual understanding. So bracket the questions of agreement about policy. Let's just try to get to mutual understanding. Let's just try to understand each other. And it seems to me there's plenty of work to be done there. And that, my hope is that that's something that doesn't require staking out a political position. Because I don't need to tell you what to think about abortion if I'm just trying to get 2 different groups to understand what they think about abortion.
What are the best ways for us to get people to come to a mutual understanding? Not agreement, but stage 1. What did you find in your research, or what did you suggest ultimately were top 2 or 3 ways to get people to come to a mutual understanding?
Well, this is something I don't feel I have a good view about. I mean, I've got some sort of rough intuitions. The stuff on political polarization, as you saw when you read through some of the stuff on my CV, it's not where my research is. I mean, I've published a couple of essays sort of on the Enlightenment and what I think about Enlightenment principles in terms of primarily German idealism and its influence on American pragmatism. But this isn't what I do my research on. So I don't feel terribly confident to give sort of a pat list. But I mean, at some level, I think that as educators, we should try to model careful and moderate characterizations of the views that are at issue. And then my own view is that it's something like a norm of a healthy community that you talk to people who have different views than yours. And so this means that, for instance, so some people, with some of the stuff that's gone on in the last 3 or 4 years in the US, there's this real big push against fascists and Nazis. And yes, let's not have fascists and Nazis in our communities. But I worry that those terms get bandied about in certain ways that prevents an opportunity for conversation because they're just othered. They're just made into the other. And of course, the right does the same thing. I mean, the kind of invective that you see thrown about by people, say on Fox News, is as unhealthy as anything that comes from the left. There's no doubt about that. But my own view is, look, if there are Nazis in your community, there's something like a defeasible but obligation to talk to the Nazis. Like we've got to endeavor to try to communicate with them. Now, there may come a time where the right thing to do is to affix bayonets. And so it's not like talking is the only thing that you should be permitted to do when you're surrounded or when you have Nazis in your community. But I think that insofar as there are people who have views that you disagree with in your community, even if you vehemently disagree with them, it's something like a defeasible norm that you're obliged to, at least not individually, but that people should in general be willing to talk to those people. So I think at some level, part of it is just trying to have a conversation with people that you don't agree with.
So what I heard you say is, if you're going to talk about an issue, try to do it in a moderate manner. Don't go for the polarizing, extreme takes on an issue. If you want to have a real conversation, and try to talk to people who you may not like, who have views that you don't support. And if we did those two things, it would push back on the growth of polarization that we're seeing.
I think I hope that's right. And again, this stuff about and so Sean Stevens has done some of this about the influence of things like media, it turns out there's fairly strong correlations between any kind of media consumption and more polarization on the part of the wings. And further, higher education. The more you go through higher education, the more individuals tend to be polarized in terms of these things. And I think that's a shame. And I think that one way of trying to overcome some of that is just trying to talk to people on the other side. I mean, I don't think you should always be trying to talk to the extremists on the other side. But if it's true, if this Pew Research Center data holds up and there are a fairly substantial portion of people who are in the middle of the political spectrum. So if you're not among Americans who have no higher education, more than 50% identify as neither left or right. They identify themselves as somewhere in the middle. And even if you take the whole population, including the college educated, even though college education tends to skew to the left, even the whole population of the United States, including college educated, they tend to identify themselves as 40% as being neither on the left or on the right. They see themselves as being in the middle. And so what I would like to see is more people who are in the middle, but willing to talk to other people on the other side, people who have views that are themselves fairly moderate, but that differ with the ones that we ourselves might have, in the interest of having those kinds of conversations. Now, eventually you want to be able to talk to the extremists and get the extremists to be part of the conversation as well. But at the beginning, I think it would be really a good thing if we could show both the people who are in control of the media institutions that are communicating to us the views that we think other people have, and to show the other people that are in our community that actually most of us are in the middle. Most of us don't have those extreme views.
Well, with respect, if it's 40% are on the left or the right, that's the minority, right, of the total picture?
That's true. So, but that's I don't know what the division is for the other. I don't recall off the top of my head what the division is for the other 60%. But that's a substantial minority. And if it does, I mean, if you just look at elections, my guess is it's going to be something like 30 and 30. So that would be a minority in terms of the whole, but it's a majority minority.
Sure. I've heard this number. I've heard 40. I've heard 20%. And I just keep saying, okay, but that still means the majority of the population is polarized. If we're going, here's the moderate middle, and we need to focus on them, and they're a sizable minority, and they haven't been touched.
I mean, just identifying with being on the left or on the right doesn't necessarily mean you're polarized, right? I mean, you may just, I vote Republican. I'm in Montana now, and I've seen bumper stickers a couple of times. Vote red. Don't turn Montana into what you fled. Keep Montana red.
Nice.
So there are people who think, I'm a conservative. I vote Republican, and that's what I do. And certainly for those people who are exposed to at least the popular media organs that are speaking to conservatives, they're liable to have a pretty extreme view of the other side, and that's a problem. But is that a problem because they're conservative? I don't think so. My sense is that's a problem because of the kinds of media that's being consumed by conservatives, and that's a problem because of the kinds of media that's being produced for conservative audiences.
Yeah, I'd heard some research that said, unfortunately, the more politically involved you become, the more likely it is for you to fall into a polarization camp, and that there's a lot of people who claim to be independents, and maybe in their heart they are, but when it comes voting time, they line right up with the party. So that's not my opinion. Those are just some studies I've heard.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about Montana, though.
Mm-hmm.
Have you personally noticed a change in Montana from, say, 2015 to now? Or has there been no change and things aren't polarized there at all, and it's just like it was in the 1990s?
Well, it's tough for me to say because I haven't lived in Montana since 2006. I come back on vacation whenever I can, basically. I mean, I think this is the last best place, and I think it's great. And then the place I'm from is Bozeman, which you may have heard of, which is a shame, but it's becoming more well known. And Bozeman has definitely changed in the last 6 years, 7 years. I mean, 2015, it's definitely changed since 2015, but that's on a trajectory that it's been on since before I left. And in terms of whether it's become more polarized, that's hard to say. I'm just not sure.
What changes did you notice in Bozeman?
Well, that's mostly by way of things like people moving in here and the cost of living. I was home a couple of years ago and saw a comparison of housing prices in Bozeman from 2020 to 2021, and it was just crazy what happened.
Okay, so a lot of people move into the city. They're the one big city, and it's becoming much larger, and the real estate prices are going up.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any political differences with Bozeman as the way it was before? Do they seem more liberal or conservative, or it's hard to tell?
Well, Bozeman is in Gallatin County, so the county has voted Democrat for quite a while now.
Okay.
So, and maybe to the extent that there are more people who vote Democrat coming in, that's shifting the demographics, at least voting demographics, more toward the left. But it's been left leaning for a while. It's a university town, and we've got a couple of ski hills nearby, and there's a symphony, so it skews toward that direction to begin with. My suspicion is that once you get outside of the big cities, Bozeman, Missoula, Great Falls, Billings, and get into some of the smaller communities, there will be more aggravation on the part of people from those areas with respect to how they feel about folks who are moving into Bozeman. I mean, I know that's true just of my friends and family that are here. They tend not to like some of the stuff that happens as a result of people coming in from other places and wanting to preserve a certain kind of life.
You have seen it. There's a lot of people who say there's a big divide between the urban areas being Democrat and the rural areas being conservative, and that there's a geographic dimension to the political polarization, not just ideological.
So this to riff on that thought right there, this is something that struck me after Trump's election. And in fact, one of the first essays I wrote in this vein was published at Quillette. And I said that I thought the big difference was between not the left and the right, the conservative liberals and conservatives, or progressives and conservatives, but between what I called the urban globalists and the non-urban nationalists. And that in the United States, that was the big division. And the urban globalists are people living in places like New York City and LA and San Francisco and Miami, who identify more with people in places like Toronto and London and Berlin than they do with people in places like small town Louisiana or small town Montana. And people living in small town Louisiana and small town Montana who identify more with people living in small town Montana and small town Louisiana than they do with people living in Miami and New York City and LA. Now, a year or two later, a British political scientist, David Goodhart, published a book called The Road to Somewhere. His view is that there are people from somewhere and people from anywhere. And I think that it's tracking a similar kind of distinction. So yeah, I suspect that that's the real divide. And what's interesting about the Trump election is that, Fox News had this graphic that they would put up. I think it was Tucker Carlson had this graphic that they would put up after Trump won the election that would show the county-wide division of left and right. And then it turns out you look by counties, you do by the states, red and blue, and it seems like, okay, maybe it's close to half, but you do it by counties and it's a bunch. But the single biggest division that decided the election in terms of demographics. So if you take So Clinton wins by, or in terms of the population,
Right.
just the numbers, something like 50 million to 58.5 million. But if you take out the 5 boroughs of New York City and LA, so LA County, take out those 6 counties, Trump wins by about 1.5 million.
Yep.
So because there's so many people in those 2 urban centers that are willing to vote the way they vote.
Yep.
And so that's one of those things that we really have to, as a country, we have to decide what this means. Because the Electoral College was set up for the same reason we have a House of Representatives and a Senate. The House of Representatives is proportional, but the Senate, 2 senators from every state. So the Electoral College is the same thing. They didn't want big cities, big population centers to dominate the rest of the country. Well, this is something we're going to have to decide as Americans whether we want to keep.
I agree. And after 2016, articles came out saying, well, Trump lost the popular vote and Hillary won the popular vote, but really only by the population of California. There were many articles saying that specifically, like if you take out California, and this terrified Californians because I'm here, if you take out California, more of your fellow Americans voted for Trump.
Yeah. Well, and what I said just a minute ago, even smaller, just 6 counties, LA County and the 5 boroughs in New York City.
Right. And I don't think it helped polarization when they talked to Hillary Clinton about that map and, look how much land you lost. And she goes, well, I got the coastal cities and that's where everything cool happens.
Yeah.
It was kind of a slam on, screw the rest of those people. And then on top of her comment about what half of all Trump's followers or a quarter were just deplorables. And she took like about 6 months to a year to apologize for that. Not a good look. I mean, as far as saying I'm a president for everybody in America, obviously Trump was a divider. I don't like Trump. I think he's a bad guy. I think he's a racist. I'm Mexican. But I'm just trying to point out a little bit like Hillary didn't exactly do everything right every step of the way either.
Definitely didn't do any favors with that comment. I was living in Pittsburgh at the time, and there was a guy around the corner from where I live, Rich. He was a retired worked for the city of Pittsburgh. And had done that his whole life. And I saw him one afternoon. He said, I voted Democrat in every election since I could vote. And she is talking about me. I mean, it really struck a chord with people.
I have tried to point that out to some people. You can't talk like that. You can't say, even if you don't like the other side, you're supposed to, because people would say, well, Trump's so divisive. And I go, well, what about Hillary Clinton saying, a good chunk of the other guys' sides are just deplorables, like just garbage humans. We don't need them. They can all go in the trash. I mean, you just wrote off like 20, 40 million Americans and you're running for president. And they go, oh, well, she walked it back. Yeah. Months and months and months and months later, really long time later. It was not the next day. It was, and then they blame Trump, going, well, Trump will say something and he'll never apologize for it. Yeah, like Clinton on that statement. So, but you won't hear that. So it's interesting to hear people in the Midwest heard that and they didn't appreciate it. They don't like being told you're worthless or not important, or the really important Americans are, in the New York boroughs or the Los Angeles area. I get that all the time. I'm here in Fresno. All we hear about is the Bay Area and LA. And I go, there's the rest of California too. We're diverse. We care. We do stuff.
Yeah.
We produce 90% of the food that everyone eats, but whatever. Could you tell me again the term urban globalist versus what was the other term?
So the way I was putting it was the urban globalist and the non-urban nationalist. David Goodhart's view, it's more punchy. It's the people from anywhere and the people from somewhere.
Yeah. So that definitely fits. Have you heard of the Big Sort?
The term is familiar, but I can't speak to it.
So basically, it was this idea roughly in the 1990s. There was a guy called Bill Bishop, and he wrote a book called The Big Sort. And what he was saying was Americans are geographically sorting themselves into red and blue. Now, he said that a while back. NPR has corroborated this. They did a story in 2008 corroborating it, 2017, and 2022. In addition, New York Times has also corroborated this, and 538. So Bishop wrote his book like almost 2 decades ago. Other groups have come forward and said, no, it's still accurate. And there was another study, I think, out of England in 2018. But basically, this is what it shows. So if you look at the map in the top left, top right-hand left, is 1992. And the map at the bottom left is 2016. So top right, 92, bottom left, I'm sorry, top left.
Yeah.
Top left is 1992. Yeah. Bottom left is 2016. So if you look at 1992, top left, red means don't even run here. This is a landslide election county for Republicans. Republicans always win by 20 percentage points more at congressional and presidential elections. Blue means don't even run here if you're not a Democrat. These are Democratic landslide election counties. Democrats won by 20 percentage points or more. Landslide election counties were not the majority of America. They remember half or under half. The gray means competitive elections. Okay. Sometimes they vote for McCain. Sometimes they vote for Obama. It depends on who's saying what and how it fits with the country and the temperament at the time. So you can go from 1992, and this looks at 96, 2000, 04 to 08, 2000. Drop down to 2016, bottom left. Almost all the grays wiped out.
Yeah.
It's almost all landslide election counties. And so the Big Sort has decided that since the 90s till now, people have been moving. But even if they weren't moving, maybe they just kind of shifted their opinion locally because the area became more liberal or more conservative and they wanted to fit in. But we've been ideologically sorting ourselves geographically in America for 30 years. And this seems to fit with what you said about urban globalists versus non-urban nationalists, or the comment about Bozeman, Montana, and once you get outside of the cities. That's exactly what all these people are saying is we've kind of sorted ourselves these ways. And it's not new. It didn't happen last year. It's been going on 3 decades. Does this seem reasonable to you, or does this seem kind of outlandish and crazy?
No, this doesn't seem outlandish and crazy. I taught a course last semester for the first time, and I'm definitely going to teach it again, on the psychological foundations of morality. There's been a bunch of interesting work done in social science, psychological and social science, on moral judgments and the way we come to moral judgments, things that are associated with moral judgments. And one of the units I looked at is in one of the units I looked at the difference between people who vote left and people who vote right with regard to things like where they tend to live, how they react to different things. So it turns out people who live in cities tend to vote left and tend to have different psychological traits. So they have a lower or a higher capacity for tolerating disgusting things. So is this something that is telling us something about the kind of sensibilities that are necessary to live in communities where people are packed together? And then how old does this stuff go back? You know, as a philosopher, one of the things we can do is we can think about things from a very general perspective. And so one of the things I was encouraging my students to think about was just the difference between conflicts between urban and rural communities through history, but then some of it even prehistorical. So think about the story in Genesis about Cain and Abel, just a bizarre story where God asks for the best offering from each of the two, and Cain gives grain, and Abel gives an animal for slaughter, and God tells Cain that wasn't good enough. It's not clear why, and then Cain kills Abel. And one explanation for that, one interpretation that some priests and rabbis have given, is that is a reflection that Cain thought that what God wanted was a blood offering. Well, one thing you can see there is the conflict between agriculturalists and pastoralists, people who are living in communities where you're raising grain as groups, and people who are living in a more open life and environment in an open landscape. That's also something. So there's some work done on Appalachia, the groups of people who moved to Appalachia from basically the borderlands in Great Britain, between Ireland and England and Scotland and England and Wales, and difference between pastoralist and agriculturalist backgrounds there too. And it also looks like there's some degree of heritability in terms of left or right political sentiments. So I really wonder whether we're dealing with something here that transcends generations and transcends even cultures, that there's really a kind of accelerating trend here, and we as social scientists and thinkers need to try to grapple with that. Anyway, that's all very speculative. I mean, there's work on this stuff, but this is relatively recent. It's only about 10 or 15 years that people have been looking at these sorts of correlations.
That's an interesting thought, because we've seen that in America, at least with political polarization, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that people are very easily separating into cities and rural areas with different preferences for residential, how they want to live, different lifestyles, different things they're tolerating and attracted to. And we've just assumed, well, that's just because of modern life and where they got these ideas, probably from the TV, and, I don't like that and I want to live in here. But that's an assumption. We don't know that for a fact. And what you're suggesting, I think, is that it may go back to the very beginning. We know that the first city started because of agriculture, grain harvesting, which meant if you weren't there, you were in the rural area. So what if this rural-urban conflict might be baked into us, possibly going way, way, way back, thousands of years? And that's why it's so prevalent today. It's inherent in us. The conditions were just ripe again for it to pop back up. Yeah. I don't know, but I just find that an interesting theory.
Yeah, neither do I. And it's one of the things that makes me want to teach this class again, because I want to look at more of this research and try to come to terms with some of it. Some of it is, I think, not very good. We took a critical view of some of what we were looking at, but there's some probative results that I think are worth more attention.
I'm remembering I read a lot as a teenager about medieval Japan and the rise of the samurai. And before I even studied urban planning, they had this weird idea that all the cities were infested with demons in medieval Japan. And if you went to the cities, you would turn evil because you would become infested with demons. And the reasoning was people in the farms generally were good. And then they'd go to the city and they'd get into gambling and prostitution and debt and fights and stabbings, et cetera. And they go, and if you just stayed out of the cities, you didn't get involved in that. So it must be demons. And that's a concept that's 500 years old. They were already saying, I don't know about those city folks. And that's in a culture very different from the West, and yet it's still there. When I see these maps about rural-urban divide, I go, why was Japan talking about this 500 years ago?
When I was leaving Pittsburgh, as I was doing this discussion group on American national identity, and then as the Trump thing came along, we were for a portion of time we were reading stuff from the founding fathers, so the Federalist Papers and letters among them, and just the contrast between the arguments that were given in the Federalist Papers to accept the Constitution and the debates between Trump and folks, and it was just quite shocking and depressing to see this stuff. But on this point in particular, Thomas Jefferson, in a letter, I tried to find it, but I couldn't find the exact quote, so this is going to be rough. In a letter this was while he was ambassador to France, I believe. He was living in Europe at the time, and I think in Paris. And he writes this letter back home, and he says that he thinks that the system they've set up in the United States will last for centuries, so long as they can keep moving to arable land. But that when we get, so this is the quote, I did find this a little bit, but when we get piled upon one another in large cities, as in Europe, we shall become corrupt, as in Europe.
Nice.
Now remember, this is Jefferson, right? The slave-owning former governor of the colony of Virginia. So he has a particular view about these things.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this goes not 500 years, but this goes back at least a couple of hundred years, and in our country as well. This is something that they were aware of. And again, that was one reason to have both a Senate and a House of Representatives and the electoral colleges. They were trying to balance the right of the individual states. You know, we're a federated republic of states. We're not a democracy. They were trying to balance the right of individual states to have those powers that weren't explicitly given to the federal government in the Constitution, with the right of groups of people to say, well, look, we don't want to be constrained by what a handful of folks in Montana think about things.
That's fair. We'll have to leave it there. I really appreciate you coming out. I want to ask you one last question. It's my favorite question to ask. And then I'll send you a copy of the video in about an hour, right afterwards. One is, if you know anybody who'd be willing to be part of an honest conversation, we'd love to talk to them. They could be an activist or a professor. If you can think of anybody.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Good.
So I will say, I was expecting this question because I saw you did an interview with Lee Jussum, who I think is just the bee's knees when it comes to social science research that goes against the grain of what a lot of people are doing.
Oh, yeah.
And I saw that at the end of your interview with Lee that you asked him that question. So I thought, well, if he asked me, what would I say? So I've got three.
Okay.
I imagine you're aware of Jonathan Haidt's work.
Yes. I've tried to reach out. Yeah.
He's incredibly busy, but I would recommend Haidt. Okay. There's a young philosopher at MIT. He was actually at Pitt for a little while, but not while I was there, but he's back at MIT, Kevin Dorst. And he does work on political polarization. And he's a young guy. So my guess is he'd be interested and he'd have interesting things to say. Although it may be the case that his CV is going to have a bunch of essays that is like, what the hell is this about? But he does work on political polarization as well. Okay. And then the third is Rosemary Smith, and she works for the Getting Better Foundation. And they've produced a documentary called Trust Me that's about media literacy. And I think it's really good work. And my guess is she'd be interested in talking with you as well.
Done. Thank you. Okay, last question.
Yes.
You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person watching this interview. They watched it. They thought it was really great. They learned a lot of stuff they didn't know. They're struggling to recall everything in the video, but they say, you know, there's this one thing that the professor said, and it's a week later after I watched the video. I'm struggling to remember what was in the video, but this one thought I can't get out of my head. What is that one thought you want an unknown person to not be able to stop thinking about 5 days after watching the video?
Talk with and listen to people who disagree with you and try to understand why they think what they think. I think before you can have agreement, ultimately you want agreement because we've got to make decisions together. But before you can have agreement, you've got to have understanding.
We'll leave it there. I want to say thanks for coming out, Professor. I'll invite you back out and we'll have a conversation on some of the other issues.
Great. I really appreciate it.
I will email you shortly with a copy of the video, and I want to say thank you for coming out. I deeply appreciate it.
Thank you, Marcus. Take care.